On behalf of the Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana, thank you for joining us for this virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival presentation. This program is our One Book, One Festival selection, A Gathering of Old Men by Ernest J Gaines. Discussing the book today is Gary Richards. Gary Richards is Professor of English and Chair of the Department of English and Linguistics at the University of Mary, Washington. He is the author of Lovers and Beloveds, Sexual Otherness in Southern Fiction, 1936 to 1961, as well as numerous essays on Southern literature and culture, including, most recently, Tennessee Williams and the Burden of Southern Sexuality Studies, and Queering Welty's Male Bodies in the Undergraduate Classroom. Ladies and gentlemen, Gary Richards.
Hello, I am Professor Gary Richards. I teach at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and that's where I'm coming to you from today. I am thrilled to continue my association with the Louisiana Book Festival. I think it is such an important thing, and I am also honored to be able to talk to you about Ernest Gaines and one of his most important novels, A Gathering of Old Men. Let me say from the beginning that I am not a Gaines scholar. There are many fine scholars who are doing more in-depth work biographically and literarily on Gaines, but Gaines is someone that I have been teaching over the course of 25, 30 years in the classroom, his novels and his fiction. What this presentation today is going to try to do is a couple of things. The first, to give you, if you are a new reader to Ernest Gaines, and particularly to A Gathering of Old Men, some biographical context, who the man was, what his literary influences were, what he produced, things of that matter. Then we'll move to the novel itself. We will go into a formalist analysis. This is often the way that I try to teach literature in my own classrooms at the university level, is looking at form first, understanding how the text is constructed, how we're being manipulated by that structure, and then move into the final section, which is the content. Looking at what are the preoccupations that Gaines has in this novel, who he's paying tribute to, how he's paying tribute to it. And this is where then we might think about sociological lenses. How is he looking at race, at gender, at class, all of which are very important in this novel. So that's the goal here. Ernest James Gaines, he is usually referred to as Ernest Gaines or Ernest J Gaines, was born on the 15th of January, 1933 in Pointe Coupee Parish, Louisiana. For those of you who may not be familiar with Louisiana geography, this parish is slightly northwest of Baton Rouge. It is along the Mississippi River, and this is where Gaines's ancestors had lived, and indeed many of them been enslaved before the Civil War on a plantation where he was born. He was the oldest of the children born to Manuel and Adrienne Gaines. That couple would eventually divorce. His mother would remarry, and there would be, within these blended families, 12 children. Gaines was the oldest of those. He was raised there on that plantation in Pointe Coupee Parish, and it became very important to him later when he began his literary imagination because he used it as the basis of a fictional parish, St. Raphael Parish, and New Roads is roughly the inspiration for Bayonne, that is the parish seat of his fictional St. Raphael Parish. So much like Faulkner does with Yoknapatawpha, you've got Gaines coming back using this locale again and again, and it is based very directly upon that parish where he was raised. His education was limited, of course, because of that time period and because of being African American and in a rural area. He was educated there on the plantation for a while and then sent to a private Catholic school. But when he was 15, he moved to Vallejo, California, just kind of north of San Francisco. That's where his mother and stepfather had moved, and he went there to continue his education. Just to historicize this a bit, you might think about this as being part of the long Great Migration. When we think about African Americans in the US South, even before slavery, looking to escape, going north. After slavery, the migration northward, sometimes first to big cities in the US South, but then going northward to places like Chicago, like Philadelphia, like New York City, to Harlem in particular, and sometimes even as far as Canada. By the time we get to the 20th century, that migration has reoriented itself. So in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, we often see African Americans going west, to California, to Arizona, to places like that. And Gaines's mother and stepfather, and then later Gaines himself, was part of that, going to California. It was there that he was educated. He served 2 years in the Army and then began writing seriously. His first short story was called The Turtles. It was published in 1956. And the San Francisco State University College magazine. So that was his first publication, but it wasn't really a professional one. He begins writing seriously at that point and has a string of primarily novels. Now, he does write short stories, but it's his novels that gained probably the most attention over his life. So his first two were Catherine Carmier, which was published in 1964, and Of Love and Dust, which was published in 1967. These garnered some attention, including in Of Love and Dust, someone as notable as James Baldwin, praising it, singling it out for complicated depictions of African Americans in the US South, in Louisiana in particular. His short stories, these early short stories, were collected and published in 1968 in Bloodline. One of those stories, the first one, was then turned into a children's text, a children's novel, A Long Day in November, and that was published in 1971. But that year, oh, I'm sorry, I almost forgot. Let's see. Also, a lesser known one is In My Father's House, which was 1978, I believe. But 1971 was a really important year for him because that was when he published the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. It garnered attention that the previous works had not. It was also in 1974 turned into a TV movie produced by CBS with Cecily Tyson playing Miss Jane Pittman. And if you're not familiar with that novel, the convention is a recorded history of a woman who was born in slavery and lived until the 1960s, going into the civil rights period, and kind of using her as a lens to assess African American history from that woman's perspective. So that really garnered a great deal of attention. Alice Walker, for instance, praised it in much the same way that Baldwin had praised Of Love and Dust. The next novel was 1983, A Gathering of Old Men, which we'll be looking at. And then in 1993, a decade later, was A Lesson Before Dying. A Lesson Before Dying, I think most critics agree now, is probably the most polished, the most effective, the best of Gaines's fiction. It really is an amazing novel. It deals with an African-American school teacher working with a man who has been condemned to execution to come into a sense of self-worth. It was picked up by Oprah. It was a book choice for her television program. And in 1999, HBO produced a film version of it starring Don Cheadle that also garnered quite a bit of praise. With the turn into the 2000s, Gaines's writing slowed down. The last thing that he had published as far as major piece of fiction is The Tragedy of Brady Sims, that was published in 2017. And it's a very slender novel, a novella. You might even think about it as a long short story. He has a few other things, some essays and stories were published in 2005 as Mozart and Lead Belly, and these are all widely available. A lot of this writing was done while he was leading kind of a two-site existence, shuttling back and forth between California, San Francisco in particular, and Louisiana, living there kind of in central Louisiana. That changed a little bit in 1981. That's when he became the writer in residence at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And I believe he stayed there until 2004 when he retired and became writer in residence emeritus. Late in his life, he built a home in Point Coupé Parish on part of the plantation where he grew up. And he lived there with his wife, Diane Saulney, who he married, I believe, in 1993, if I look at my notes. During this life, he was acknowledged for really the amazing outpouring that he had done in fiction. So for instance, he received the National Humanities Medal in 2000 from President Bill Clinton. For A Lesson Before Dying, he received the National Book Critics Circle Award for fiction and many, many other accolades for that. I'm so used to being in the classroom. This is where I want to pause and say, do you have any questions? But if you do have questions as you are listening to this, please do know there are ample resources online. If you have questions about Gaines, you can go to 64 Parishes, for instance. There is quite a bit of information at that Louisiana-based website for Gaines. And then there's also a great deal of scholarly attention that has been given to Gaines. He is absolutely canonical, I think, within African-American literature, within Southern literature, and to a lesser degree within US literature. But there are plenty of resources on Gaines that you should be able to tap into if you have other questions. Okay. As we shift to the novel itself, I want to read you a statement that Gaines himself gave before one of the readings that he did from this novel. So this is Gaines as he was speaking to an audience. He said, "On that sugarcane plantation in Louisiana where I was born, my people had lived for 5 generations. I knew a man, Mr. Walter Zeno, who died on that plantation in 1978, who had known my grandparents' grandparents. As a child, I had often heard my great aunt speak of mom and pop, but I had always thought she was talking about her parents and my grandparents' parents. Mr. Zeno, who went by a variety of names, Pete, Ridley, Salute, told me that mom and pop were my grandparents' grandparents. My ancestry has nothing to do with what I'm going to read, other than to point out that we had been on that same plantation for 5 generations, 6 generations, if you want to count my 2 brothers' children who were from there, but only 5 if you wish to stop with my generation. My older people were slaves who worked the land. After emancipation, my people would still work on the same plantation as free men. By the time I came along, 1933, the land was just being turned over to sharecropping. Here, something else happened. Under the plantation system, only Blacks had worked the land. Once it was turned over to sharecropping, the land was divided among Blacks and whites, the whites being the Cajuns of that area. By being white, the Cajuns would get the better land, the front land, the upper land. The Blacks got the bottom land, the land nearest the swamps, the land with less drainage. As a result, the front land, the upper land, grew better crops. But when you grew better crop, you were able to buy better tools, which result in growing even better crop. Soon there was a great division between white and black sharecroppers. Because the whites grew better crop, they were able to buy tractors, while the blacks still used mules and plows. One tractor did more work than 6 mules and a plow. So with that statement, I think Gaines was setting up for his audience when he was reading from the novel a couple of things. One, clearly the second half of what I read is the major tension that is going on here. And this is what we'll talk about when we get to the content of the competing groups of people who have a stake in this physicality. And if we use a simple black-white binarism, Gaines consistently puts pressure on that so that there is no single black voice, there is no single white voice. And so that's something we'll come back to. It's the first half that I want to begin with, kind of as we think about this novel before narrowing in on form. And that is it being a tribute, it being something of a nostalgic love note to the people who, whether his family or other people on that plantation, who influenced him. Gaines, throughout his life, paid homage to those people who were very important to him. So for instance, there are a number of dedicatees for the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, but one of them is his great aunt, Augustine Jefferson, I believe, who, even though she was not a direct model for Miss Jane, she was a person who was born disabled, was unable to walk, and yet still instilled in Gaines a sense of ability, of accomplishment, about leading one's life. And he dedicates that novel in part to her. In A Gathering of Old Men, if you have the copy in front of you, or we'll be reading along at some point, he dedicates it to Mr. Walter Zeno, the person that he cited in that opening that I just read. The book says, "This book is dedicated to the memory of Mr. Walter Zeno, AKA Salute, Ryder, Pete, and a few other names." This sets up, I think, both that homage to a man who was a mentor to Gaines, but who also was a link to the past, someone who would have known his grandparents' grandparents. To think about that. It also sets up the idea of nicknames. As you begin exploring this novel, looking at the structure of it, it has multiple narrators, and almost always the narrator's proper name is given, but then after that, it will be his or her nickname. So if you look, for instance, this is going to be about page 41, Grant Bellow, AKA Cherry. Almost all of these African-American characters, at least, are going to have that structure, particularly the old men that the title refers to. And I think this suggests kind of a duality of existence that Gaines is paying tribute to. That is kind of the formal naming, but then how that person is known in the community. Because this is a novel that is a hymn to community. As in most of Gaines's fiction, it tilts towards men as opposed to women, although there are female characters here. It really is an analysis of male homosociality, and in particular, Black male homosociality, how these old men have throughout their lives sustained one another, bonded with one another, how they have been personalized through those nicknames. So this resonated with me when I was growing up in rural Texas, having any number number of Black men and white men who had this duality, so that my own great-grandfather was known as Bush. I had uncles who were known as Bud and Bo and Squink, none of them their real names. Knowing African-American men or hearing stories of African-American men that had nicknames like Pretty Boy and Head, things like that. So that Gaines begins with that, humanizing these people. The structure that he uses is one that I think pays homage to his literary influences. Throughout his life, Gaines was asked who had impacted him as a writer, and he regretted that he couldn't say that other Black writers had influenced him. Zora Neale Hurston had some impact, but he said that when he was being educated in the 40s and the 50s, that was typically not the thing, that there would be very few African-American writers in public libraries and things like that. So instead, he most typically cited fiction writers from Russia, Gogol, Tolstoy, folks of that nature. Then also kind of high modernist, Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and William Faulkner. I think you can see frequently in Gaines kind of Stein and Hemingway's terse rhythms. He is not a prolix writer the way that Faulkner is. Usually you've got Gaines novels being contained, manageable, digestible, having those rhythms. But he does pay homage to, and simultaneously critique Faulkner, I think, by using Faulkner's structure. One of the things that Faulkner did repeatedly, particularly in As I Lay Dying, which ironically is one of his texts that's least concerned with race relations in the South, is to use a series of first-person narrators, so that you would have the person's name and that person just begins speaking, not necessarily as if in real time, but more an interior monologue. I'm so sorry about that. That's the form that Gaines uses here. And I think it accomplishes a number of things. One, it provides intimacy. You do have, with a first-person narrator, that voice speaking to us. When we see an I, we tend to bond with it. So think about some of the famous first-person narrators, Huckleberry Finn, Scout Finch, Bone Boatwright in Dorothy Allison's Bastard out of Carolina, that it creates that intimacy. And yet, by using multiple narrators that keep shifting, often these chapters are only 2 or 3 pages, some of the longer ones maybe 10 or 15, but it gives variety. I mean, so that it's almost like a kaleidoscope. We keep twisting around this story. Here's one perspective, here's another perspective. And it also engages us because with the first person narration, we have to ask, do we trust this person? What are the ideological investments of this person? What are the limitations? So Gaines uses that. So he begins very nicely, I think, by having a very young African-American boy to speak to us. So that is George Eliot Jr., AKA Snookum. And what Snookum does is kind of set the action in motion. In the novel, a Cajun sharecropper has been killed on the Marshall plantation. The Marshalls are an old white family, largely in decay, not very functioning. They have a young member, Candy, who is very attached to the plantation. She's also very attached to a particular African-American tenant farmer there, Matthew. And when the Cajun is killed there on Matthew's, outside of Matthew's house, she sweeps in, she begins to organize, and she sends Snookum to gather other old men to come to all have shot their rifles off using the same type of shell, so to complicate when the sheriff gets there. So that's kind of what sets us in motion. And it's Snookum who begins that. So we begin with a child's perspective, and it engages us because of kind of the simplicity of the language, but also he doesn't understand what's going on in much the same way that we as readers don't understand. So we're kind of brought in through this, and then it begins to shift through a range of perspectives, white characters, Black characters, and in particular about the titular old men. So I think the form here is very important. It is paying tribute to Faulkner, the way that Gaines did in multiple ways. The difference is then including those Black voices. This is a Black narrative focused on Black experiences. Having those voices be in first person is going to be particularly important because we have multiple layers of first person. We might have one of the old men telling the story of the confrontation where another old man tells his first person narration. So we've got multiple first person voices, I think, kind of swaddling one another here. Another thing formalistically that I think is important is Gaines's attention to dialect. He is a realist. He is trying to replicate the speech that he remembered these working class African Americans using in the 1960s, 1970s when this is set. And so he does this, you'll see early on in the novel, characters refer to the Gary, G-A-R-R-Y. And what that is gallery. So if you're thinking about the gallery in front of a house, they would pronounce it Gary. And so you have repeatedly him, Gaines going for that realism, replicating these voices, their dialect, their speech, their idioms. You're going to be able to see different educational levels between characters, between white characters, Black characters, and within those. Another thing that Gaines does is, in his realistic mode, he uses derogatory language, racist language that I think for most of us in the 21st century puts our teeth on edge. It is, the N-word is used very, very frequently. As I was rereading the novel, Gaines uses that, I think, out of that realistic impulse. This would have been the language that he would have understood folks as he was growing up from the 30s, even into the 70s in rural South using. So know that if a little bit later, if I'm quoting and editing out, that's what I'm doing. Okay. Because of time, I'm going to just go ahead and shift to the content. Because as Gaines suggested in that introductory set of remarks that he gave, the content is about people in conflict with one another and those racial groups having tensions between themselves and within themselves. So if we start with the African Americans first, one of the tensions is between men and women. That this is, in this realism, Gaines is replicating some of the sexism, that many of the old men use a great deal of sexist rhetoric when dealing with their wives to go and support Matthew at this. So he's replicating that. I don't think he's endorsing it. He's simply giving that realism. Probably the most significant tension, though, is based around issues of color, what is often referred to as colorism within various racial groups. And that is biases and prejudices that are held towards and by lighter-skinned people versus darker-skinned people. So Gaines has long been concerned about this in his writing. In his first couple of novels, he's very preoccupied with this. And this takes him into the territory of Creole identity. Creole is a notoriously slippery word, particularly in the Louisiana context. But by the time we get to the 20th century, rather than it referring to French or Spanish, European pureblood immigrants, it's usually a term used for light-skinned African Americans. I'm sorry, there was a pop-up that just came on my screen. So you do have various members of this group of old men having to negotiate colorism. One of the characters, as he is confessing kind of his sins, why he feels like he needs to go and protect Matthew, is because his family has not done enough to protect his sister, who, as a light-skinned African American, chose to associate with dark-skinned African Americans. When she is killed, they do not go to reclaim the body, and he is there to atone for that. I mean, so colorism is definitely percolating throughout this community, but what Gaines does in this novel, as opposed to some of his earlier ones, is to suggest this is a moment where, regardless of the color of the African Americans, they all do come together in this community. So if you're reading this, that might be something to keep your eye on, is how it's acknowledged but then overcome. Within white communities in this novel, there is a class-based tension. So you have the Marshalls, the family who own this plantation, are upper class, but then you have them standing at odds with the Cajuns. So the Bo Bhutan, the Cajun sharecropper who is killed, his father is kind of a stereotypical quasi-Klansman, Fix Bhutan, but another of his sons, Gil Bhutan, is a football player at LSU. He represents the new generation, how things are changing. And in the second half of the novel, one of the things that goes on is Fix Bhutan wants to take revenge upon his son's death. But Gil talks him out of it for a range of reasons, some of which are quite selfish. But again and again, you have Gaines reminding the tension between the land-owning whites and the landless sharecropping Cajuns. Remember, Cajuns are going to have a different history coming to Louisiana than many others. Those Creoles in the old definition, people who had been upper class, they're typically the ones that would have had property along the Mississippi River, et cetera. At the end of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, kind of one of the first global conflicts, in Canada, the French were on the losing side, and so many French peoples from Acadia were pushed out with the British control. They came south to Louisiana because much of the good farmland, plantation land, had been already taken. They were pushed further west into kind of central Louisiana, and they have traditionally been a different class then. So you've got that tension being replicated there. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move it along pretty quickly. What the novel does is, most effectively, in my opinion, is allow these old men to gain voice. And in this sense, even though Gaines does not acknowledge it as an overt set of influences, I want to suggest to you at least two African-American writers who are looking over his shoulder. One is Frederick Douglass, and the other one is Richard Wright. Both of these writers being very much concerned about Black masculinity. How does a Black man in an age of slavery, Jim Crow, going well into the 20th century and indeed into the 21st century, how do you maintain a sense of dignity, autonomy, etc.? And Frederick Douglass, in his multiple slave narratives, including the first one, the 1845 one, kind of has a balance there that, on the one hand, one writes oneself into agency. So there's lots of passages about how Douglass gains literacy, but there's also a pivotal moment where he stands up to a slave breaker who physically fights him. And it's at the center of that text, and he describes it as a glorious resurrection, that this was what got him through his period of enslavement. So given the model that at some point there has to be physical resistance, there has to be, even in the face of racist discipline, that kind of agency. Richard Wright is going to do the same thing. What's different with Richard Wright is he often focuses on the Black individual. So texts like native son, singular, Black boy, singular. It is an individual Black man standing up. You've got, in my opinion, Gaines using a community of Black men. So just like those nicknames that they've given to one another, it's all of them coming together. And even though these are men who are old, who are nostalgic, who are backwards looking, again and again, Gaines depicts them as seeing this as an opportunity to finally stand up to Mapes, that's the sheriff, who it turns out is perhaps a little more complicated than we think he's going to be. And I'm trying not to give away too many details, although this was originally meant to be the book in common. I know some of you may not have read the novel. This is an opportunity for those old Black men to finally exert that agency. So they do it, I want to offer to you, in at least two ways that replicate Frederick Douglass. On the one hand, it is through literacy, it is through orality, it is through storytelling. So as each of them come together and Mapes, the sheriff, is interviewing, what were you doing today? Each of them come up with narratives about what brought them to that plantation, why they supposedly shot Beau Boutin. So they are articulating, putting into narrative their wiles, their intelligence, why they're there. The second thing, and I think the more important thing that they do, is at the center, literally the heart of this novel, it becomes a litany of abuses, why they're standing up. And each man stands up to say why he's there today, what happened to his family, to his sister, to his brothers, how, if not fix Boutin, but the society that he is representative of, how they abused these men. And so I think putting into narrative, but like Douglass, there has to come a moment, Gaines offers, where there has to be physical resistance. There has to be a physical retaliation. And so Mapes has his assistant bring various old men up to be beaten, to be slapped, to be hit, including Billy Washington. He is one of the very first men. He's one of the oldest men. We know that he has not killed Beau Boutin, but Mapes reaches out and strikes him. And rather than this being a horrific moment, it's shocking, but Gaines suggests it's almost part of this communal ritual. Gaines is highly critical of Christianity. One of the least likable characters here is the African-American minister, Reverend Jameson. If you know his story, The Sky is Gray, you will know that ministers are not highly valued by Gaines. So for all of that critique of ministers, I think Gaines is using one of the same symbol systems that Christianity does, and that is kind of the marking of the body, such as Christ being crucified, Christ being stabbed, to show suffering, to show atonement, etc., so that each of the old men go through this abuse, but it actually gives them empowerment, gives them a sense. It's ultimately a triumphant narrative. There are some complications that happened. It turns out Matthew, of course, has not killed Beau Boutin. Another African-American man has. He returns and that plays out. But it's in that first half of the novel where we see the gathering of the old men, the narratives of the old men, and kind of the ritual there that many critics feel has a mythic quality. Kirkus Reviews, for instance, when they reviewed it in 1983, praised the first half of the novel far more than the second half. For them, the second half of the novel devolves a bit into melodrama. There's a shootout, and I'll let you decide that for yourself. But they praised in particular that first half of the novel as these men coming forward and expressing what Gaines nodded to, I think, in those opening comments, the importance of the community, even on the plantation, that freed people made for themselves up through the 1930s when Gaines was born. And I just want to read, this is probably where I will almost end, kind of an articulation. This is one character who is looking back nostalgically, paying tribute to those people, that place, that land. He says, remember, when there wasn't no weeds, remember how they used to sit out there on the Gary, Mama, Papa, Aunt Clara, Aunt Sarah, Uncle Monk, Aunt Spoodle, Aunt Thread. Remember, everybody had flowers in the yard, but nobody had floor clocks like Jack Toussaint. Every day at 4 o'clock, they opened up just as pretty. Remember. He says a little bit later, that's something you can't see, Sheriff, because you never could see it. You couldn't see Red Rider with Job, Jack with Diamond. Those are mules that the black men are working. You can't see the church with the people, and you can't hear the singing and the praying. You had to be here then to be able to don't see it and don't hear it now. But I was here then, and I don't see it now, and that's why I did it. I killed Bo-Butan. I did it for them back there under them trees. Earlier, the old men have made a very ritualistic trip to the graveyard to pay tribute to their ancestors, many of whose graves are unmarked, but they know where those graves are, and so they go through those rituals. I did it because that tractor is getting closer and closer to that graveyard, and I was scared if I didn't do it. One day that tractor was going to come in there and plow up them graves, getting rid of all proof that we ever was. Like now they trying to get rid of all proof that black people ever farmed this land with plows and mules. Like if they had nothing from the starting but motor machines. Sure, one day they will get rid of the proof that we ever was, but they ain't going to do it while I'm still here. Mama and Papa worked too hard in these fields. They, Mama, and they, Papa, worked too hard in these fields. They, Mama, and they, Papa, worked too hard to have that tractor just come in that graveyard and destroy all proof that they ever was. I'm the last one left. I had to see that the grave stayed for a little while longer, but I just didn't do it for my own people. I did it for every last one of them back there under them trees. And I did it for every 4 o'clock, every rose bush, every palm of Christian ever growed on this place. I think the novel ultimately accomplishes a great deal, even with the structural problems perhaps of the last third, but as a tribute that Gaines gave to the men and to a lesser extent the women who worked, lived, made lives, difficult as they were, on that plantation, this novel remains a really eloquent testimony to that. Where I'd like to end is with a reminder of why Gaines was chosen in the first place. As most of you know, Gaines died on November the 5th, 2019, at the age of 86 at his home there close to Oscar, Louisiana. I think that with that death, we lost truly one of the great Southern writers. And even in texts like A Gathering of Old Men, which challenges us with some of the ideas, challenges us with some of the language, perhaps doesn't always meet aesthetic demands, it nevertheless evinces in very powerful ways what an amazing writer Gaines was, particularly when paying homage to the men that was so important to him in his life. Thank you very much for listening to this and for supporting the Louisiana Book Festival. Take care.
Thank you for watching this presentation of the virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival. Please visit our official bookseller, Cavalier House Books, and receive 20% off all featured festival titles through the end of the year. A special thank you to our festival sponsors. The Louisiana Book Festival will return on October 29th, 2022.